Hello, my name is Matthew, and here is Andy. I moved the camera, so maybe Andy will hang out there for a while. And I have a read along that we've chosen together, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. And I want to talk about the first 10 or 11 chapters because we have two major set pieces, two locations that Jane Eyre spends a lot of time in and has traumatic and memorable experiences and also really influential relationships. Some of them very good, others not so good. I did have a little bit of a slow start with this book as I've been reading it and getting a sense of the narrator's point of view, her perspective in life. The more I've been reading it and just getting into her mind, I've been enjoying it more and more. So um, it begins with we have Jane Eyre. She's an orphan, and she has an aunt and an uncle. The uncle has died, but has made the aunt, Aunt Reed, promise that she'll take her in. And it's the first set piece of a young girl, not 10, or hardly 10, living in this house as an orphan, and there's housekeepers there. There's Aunt Reed, and then other children, and she is just persecuted and tormented and punished, and we're getting this perspective from a young girl that's just seeing that this is all wrong and it's unfair. I'm being mistreated, and a young child that has no power or influence. She's smart and astute, and I think her ability to observe the world around her, this small world in this house, and recognize articulately how unfair everything is around her, really adds to the emotional weight of her circumstances. There's this great scene, but it's scary and sad, of her being locked into this room on a stormy night. There's a light coming from outside. It gets extremely gothic, and there's a lot of horror elements. She's looking out the window, and is it moonlight? Is it torchlight? Is it fire? And it's hallucinatory. She ends up having a fit, which I believe this traumatizing event led to her having a seizure. A seizure. A doctor has to come. She's screaming, shrieking, and when the housekeepers come to check on her, she gets punished even more for being dramatic and emotional. The rest of her time there only gets worse. She's um, depicted, and she's told that she is a deceitful little liar, that she's no good, that she's going to hell, that she's this awful little girl that's unmanageable, disrespectful, and she's put in isolation. is kind of stuck in this room. No, no, no one to really trust. There's no comfort, no caressing, no loving. She just feels like she's alone in the world. Some of the housekeepers are nice to her. The other children are awful. As I was reading all of this, it's not that it wasn't engaging reading. I did have a concern that it felt like a story that I was already very familiar with, points and beats that I had read in other books, which doesn't really make much sense because this is I believe, much earlier than any of this examples that I was thinking of. And we finally get this episode, this interaction that really started getting my attention and getting me hooked into the novel. And we have this Mr. Brocklehurst. Mr. Brocklehurst comes to this house. He's just described as this black marble scarecrow, tall and imposing and frightening, hard carved, large exaggerated features, stern and severe, and he's in a room with this Aunt Reed. And they had this philosophical conversation about hell. What happens when you don't lead a good life, and how do you lead a good life? And it's coming from this really scary figure. And from my perspective, and spending time with Jane, feeling like my perspective is in concert with her perspective, and just thinking there's something wrong here. This Brocklehurst and Aunt Reed are not the upstanding good people that they believe they are. We find out that she's going to be sent to a institution for orphaned children. And one of my favorite moments in that first set piece is when Jane Eyre tells off this Aunt Reed, and there's a moment where she just says, we have no family relation. This is the last time I will refer to you as my aunt. And at that moment it switches, and she's now Mrs. Reed. And she just lays into her and tells her everything that she thinks about her. And the reaction of Mrs. Reed was surprising, and it felt very human, because it seemed like she didn't understand why the little girl would be mad at her, because she's the hero in her story. But she escapes. She leaves. She had some good experiences with the staff of the house, but otherwise it was just this horrible childhood. And then we get the next great set piece, which is her time at Lowood, meeting Mrs. Temple and meeting the young Helen Burns, being in this new environment, wanting to make friends, interested in learning. When she was in the house, she liked reading. She was reading Gulliver's Travels. She was reading tales from the Arabian Nights. But she's still a rather young, ignorant, naive girl, still uneducated. And she's picking up on this, realizing that There's people there reading different books. There's different kinds of classes, um, and she starts having, from everything that we know, she starts having positive, constructive um, relationships with people her own age and adults and people that um, still have power over her, but are treating her um, with guardianship. Uh, and so she's learning that there's different kinds of people in the world, and there's people that she can trust, and there's people that will be on her side and will take care of her. And so we're getting um, her her growth, her emotional growth. She has these conversations. She meets Helen Burns, and they have some of the most wonderful conversations. She was reading, I can't remember the name of the book, but she was reading that book by Samuel Johnson, and she's asking her these questions, and Helen Burns is so articulate, philosophical, and really, really smart and strange. A wonderful, wonderful character. They have so many great interactions, and Helen Burns is picked on too by one of the teachers, and Jane Eyre is saying, like, aren't you mad at that person? Like, don't you want to take your vengeance and have retribution? And Helen Burns's worldview is just so different than Jane Eyre's. They both have similar life experiences. They're both orphaned. Just a totally different worldview. Um, they both get picked on. I love reading the whole reading just reading this. I love how articulate everything is, and how eloquent, and the vocabulary that Charlotte Brontë just I don't want to say employs, but it's so eloquent, so beautifully written, and I really believe that Jane Eyre, the character, is intelligent and eloquent and articulate and well spoken, has that large vocabulary. So she's telling us this story, and even when she was very, very young, we can tell that the older Jane Eyre um, is an extremely intelligent person. I really like that about the story. Mr. Brunklehurst comes back and just it's almost like her past comes back to haunt her. Um, he puts her on a pedestal and shames her in front of the entire class, in front of the entire school, lets everyone know that she's a deceitful, lying little creature, is told to stand there in shame, tells all the teachers not to trust her, and all of the students to beware of her. It reduces her to tears. Helen Burns comes over and comforts her. The school teacher who loves these children um, takes the both of them in this just like angelic, warm, comforting episode or scene where it's the teacher and two young girls, and they just sit down and have tea and toast and cake. It's lovely. As far as her formative years, I mentioned so another favorite moment so far. I'm sorry, all of that was so garbled. She's learning that there's things to be interested in. She's learning to be curious. So she wants to learn French, and she wants to draw and paint, and she wants to read more. And there's a night where she lays down to sleep, and she's just, before she falls asleep, she's dreaming and wondering. And instead of dreaming and wondering about a decent meal, or having someone that she can trust, these very internal, immediate cravings, the kind of things that you think about when your world is very small and you have needs, you have basic needs that haven't been met. Just those kinds of things, like having clean clothes and fresh water and things to eat and someone to be there for you. She's now starting to have those things, and so she's dreaming and wondering outside of herself, and thinking about pictures and drawing and learning French and all of the books that she can read. And it's this touching but revelatory moment for her, that there's a whole wide world out there to learn about, be interested in. Just terrific. It was one of my favorite moments. Speaking of the outside world, this is not a completely insulated story. Typhoid fever comes through the school, and there's illness and death. Helen Burns becomes sick, and she's quarantined. She's separated from the school, and Jane Eyre is separated from her. And ultimately she dies. She gets to have one last moment with her, and we hear Helen Burns, we hear her dying words. Again, just haunting and touching and beautiful. Those are the two main set pieces. At that point, Jane Eyre, the narrator, tells us that this is not a normal autobiography. It doesn't have to follow an exacting formulaic chronological order, and that we're going to skip 8 years. We're going to move from her being about 10, we're going to skip 8 years to her as a young lady, is 18 years old. The school has done well for her, and she's now actually teaching there. And she now wants to leave, start doing something else, and she sends off. She gets a letter of inquiry. Someone, there's a house that she can go work at, and she's going to go off into the world. That's where we are at the moment. Really enjoying it. It took me a little time to get invested with Jane Eyre, but as I'm reading it, the more I read it, the more I'm enjoying it. And it's beautiful. It's just so beautifully written. If you're reading along, please let me know how you're enjoying it. If you're reading for the first time, or if it's a reread, this is the kind of book that I imagine most people have already read. And if you just read it and want to share any thoughts, please do. So thank you for watching. Leave a comment if you would like, and